An article in the Yale Alumni Magazine told the story of Clyde Murphy, a black man who was a member of the class of 1970. Clyde was a success story. After Yale and a law degree from Columbia, Clyde spent the next 30 years as one of America's top civil rights lawyers.
A black graduate of Yale from 1970 and a successful lawyer. Got it.
He was also a great husband and father.
A good family man. Got it.
But despite his success, personally and professionally, Clyde's story had a sad ending.
Uh-oh. I am assuming that his sad end will stand in stark contrast to his personal success. Something tragic or senseless, like being mugged randomly on the street, or being struck by a drunk driver.
In 2010, at the age of 62, Clyde died from a blood clot in his lung.
At the age of 62, he died of a blood clot. That's, and I'm not meaning to be callous here, but that's not very extraordinary. How does that cause of death stand in contrast to his personal successes? A blood clot could happen to anyone, successful or otherwise.
Clyde's experience was not unique. Many of his black classmates from Yale also died young.
Died young? Now, while I understand that the average lifespans in the West are ever increasing, and sure, 62 isn't exactly elderly these days, I dare to say that 62 isn't young.
In fact, the magazine article indicated that 41 years after graduation from Yale, the black members of the class of 1970 had a death rate that was 3 times higher than that of the average class member.
So, Yale diplomas are killing black people after they turn 60? I must be missing something.
America has recently awakened to a steady drumbeat of unarmed black men being shot by the police.
Whoa, wait a second. That's quite a jump in circumstances. You explain one man's death as a result of a blood clot, and then we're suddenly into police shootings?
What is even a bigger story is that every 7 minutes, a black person dies prematurely in the United States.
Dies prematurely? From what? What do you mean by prematurely? When I think prematurely, I think accidents or the sudden onset of terminal illness. But if you're equating blood clots at 62 and police shootings in the same bucket as prematurely, I think we're in confusing territory.
That is, over 200 black people die every single day who would not die if the health of blacks and whites were equal.
So now we're on health? What do police shootings have to do with personal health?
For the last 25 years, I have been on a mission to understand why does race matter so profoundly for health. When I started my career, many believed that it was simply about racial differences in income and education.
Okay, so you're going to provide proof to the contrary. I'm looking forward to it.
I discovered that while economic status matters for health, there is more to the story. So, for example, if we look at life expectancy at age 25, at age 25, there's a 5-year gap between blacks and whites. And the gap by education for both whites and blacks is even larger than the racial gap. At the same time, at every level of education, whites live longer than blacks. So whites who are high school dropouts live 3.4 years longer than their black counterparts.
Huh. If your argument is about race, why just focus on only whites and blacks? I mean, it seems like you're trying to say that whites naturally enjoy better health than blacks do on a one-to-one comparison. How does the health of blacks compare to, I don't know, Asians?
And the gap is even larger among college graduates. Most surprising of all, whites who have graduated from high school live longer than blacks with a college degree or more education. So why does race matter so profoundly for health? What else is it beyond education and income that might matter?
Well, that's what I'm waiting for you to tell me.
In the early 1990s, I was asked to review a new book on the health of Black America. I was struck that almost every single one of its 25 chapters said that racism was a factor that was hurting the health of blacks.
Racism. So, racism is responsible for blood clots?
All of these researchers were stating that racism was a factor adversely impacting blacks, but they provided no evidence. For me, that was not good enough.
Well, I am very glad to hear that. A claim without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So, good for you.
A few months later, I was speaking at a conference in Washington, D.C., and I said that one of the priorities for research was to document the ways in which racism affected health. A white gentleman stood in the audience and said that while he agreed with me that racism was important, we could never measure racism.
Given that racism is an ideology, a thought process, and a belief system, I'd be surprised to find out the man's claim was incorrect. I mean, how much does faith in Jesus weigh?
We measure self-esteem, I said. There's no reason why we can't measure racism if we put our minds to it. And so I put my mind to it and developed 3 scales. The first one captured major experiences of discrimination, like being unfairly fired or being unfairly stopped by the police.
Unfairly. Not illegally, but unfairly. Well, short of the demonstrable violation of the law or civil rights, isn't unfairly a subjective interpretation?
But discrimination also occurs in more minor and subtle experiences. And so my second scale, called the Everyday Discrimination Scale, captures 9 items that captures experiences like you're treated with less courtesy than others, you receive poorer service than others in restaurants or stores, or people act as if they're afraid of you.
Experiences. Poorer service. How people act. Now, that's 2 scales that seem to be based wholly on the subjectivity of events and interactions. This isn't sounding like evidence of anything. Are you going to show us these scales? How your measurements look on paper?
This scale captures ways in which the dignity and the respect of people whose society does not value is chipped away on a daily basis.
How much does dignity weigh? If I place respect into a tub of water, what is its volume?
Research has found that higher levels of discrimination are associated with the elevated risk of a broad range of diseases, from blood pressure to abdominal obesity to breast cancer to heart disease and even premature mortality.
Racism causes heart disease and breast cancer. Oh, and also blood clots. Huh. Interesting. What's the life expectancy of Hispanics in the US as compared to whites? How about Asians? Well, let's take a look real quick. So, firstly, the average mortality of blacks in the United States is 75.54 years. The average mortality of whites is 79.12 years. So, on average, whites live about 3.5 years longer than blacks. Okay. What about Hispanics? Huh. Well, would you look at that? 82.89 years. That's just over 7 more years compared to blacks. And what about Asians? 86.67. 11 more years than blacks. So, by your assertions, and by these numbers, whites experience more racism than Hispanics, and certainly more than Asians. Right?
Right? Strikingly, some of the effects are observed at a very young age. For example, a study of black teens found that those who reported higher levels of discrimination as teenagers had higher levels of stress hormones, of blood pressure, and of weight at age 20.
Yes, stress can lead to a multitude of health problems. That's not something restricted to any particular skin color. But I thought your argument was that race was the main factor. I mean, the fact that you brought up police shootings, but then didn't elaborate, has made that an effective non sequitur. And now you've moved to stress as a result of racism. So, how do you measure stress, exactly? And on any given day, how much stress is attributable to racism versus stress from ordinary work or school obligations? I am really trying to understand, but our speaker is making it awfully difficult by referring to intangibles as quantifiables.
The stress of discrimination is only one aspect. Discrimination and racism also matters in other profound ways for health. For example, there's discrimination in medical care. In 1999, the National Academy of Medicine asked me to serve on a committee that concluded based on the scientific evidence that blacks and other minorities receive poorer quality care than whites. This was true for all kinds of medical treatment, from the most simple to the most technologically sophisticated.
How did you reach these conclusions? How did you measure worse care versus better care? And if this is true for all minorities, how does that square with the average life expectancy of Asians versus blacks?
One explanation for this pattern was a phenomenon that's called implicit bias or unconscious discrimination.
Implicit bias and unconscious discrimination. How did you and the committee measure unconscious discrimination? I assume you had to conduct a sleep study.
Research for decades by social psychologists indicate that if you hold a negative stereotype about a group in your subconscious mind, and you meet someone from that group, you will discriminate against that person. You will treat them differently. It's an unconscious process. It's an automatic process.
Unconscious, subconscious, automatic. If it is unconscious and/or subconscious, how exactly have you proven that it is the cause of substandard healthcare? How are you reading the minds of healthcare workers? What do healthcare professionals think when you tell them that they're just naturally, subconsciously, and automatically racists who are hastening the deaths of their own patients?
It is a subtle process, but it's normal, and it occurs even among the most well-intentioned individuals.
It doesn't matter how good you think you are. It is always with you. It hides within the recesses of your very being. You're not even aware of it, necessarily, and thus you can never be certain that you have rid yourself of it completely. Motivations and decisions will always be suspect, and anyone coming to a doctor who doesn't look like they do, well, they're right to be suspicious because, naturally, that doctor just wants to kill you. That's about all I care to watch of that. You can find a link to the entire presentation in the description. I've covered only the first 8 minutes of it, so should you choose to watch the rest and find anything interesting in what he goes on to say, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And, as always, thank you for watching.